There is a part of you that you've been hiding your entire life, a part that's been locked away in the basement of your psyche, screaming to be heard, desperate to be seen. But you've been taught that this part of you is dangerous, unacceptable, wrong. What if I told you that this hidden part of yourself isn't your enemy? What if I told you that this shadow you've been running from is actually the key to your power, your authenticity, your freedom? And what if I told you that every single person who has ever controlled you, manipulated you, or made you feel small has been terrified of this part of you awakening? I'm about to share with you the most dangerous truth that the narcissists in your life never wanted you to discover. The very traits they shamed you for, the emotions they punished you for feeling, the authentic responses they crushed out of you, these aren't your weaknesses. These are your superpowers in disguise, and they've been waiting in the shadows for you to reclaim them. 3 years ago, I was a shell of a man. I was the perfect son, the obedient child, the people pleaser who had learned to disappear so completely that I didn't even know who I was anymore. But buried beneath all that conditioning was a rage so pure, a fire so intense, a masculine power so raw that it terrified everyone around me. And the day I stopped running from that shadow and started integrating it was the day my life changed forever. If you're ready to stop hiding from yourself, if you're ready to reclaim the parts of you that have been banished to the darkness, hit the subscribe button right now. Like this video and tell me in the comments below, what part of yourself have you been most afraid to show the world? Because I guarantee you, that's exactly where your power is hiding. Let me tell you about the night I met my shadow face to face. I was 30 years old, doing one of my deep meditation sessions, and suddenly I was confronted by this version of myself that I had never seen before. He was angry. He was rebellious. He was unapologetically masculine. He was everything I had been taught was wrong, dangerous, unacceptable. And he looked at me with such contempt and said, "You've been pretending I don't exist for 30 years, and look what it's gotten you. You're a ghost of a man, and everyone can see it." That moment shattered everything I thought I knew about healing, about spirituality, about what it means to be a good person. Because here's what Carl Jung discovered over a century ago, and what the mainstream self-help industry still refuses to acknowledge. You cannot heal what you refuse to feel. You cannot integrate what you refuse to acknowledge. And you cannot become whole while rejecting half of who you are. But before I dive deeper into this, I need to tell you something that's going to sound controversial. The reason you've been struggling with confidence, with relationships, with feeling like you're living someone else's life instead of your own, it's not because you're broken. It's not because you need more therapy or more meditation or more positive thinking. It's because you've been living as half a person, and your soul is literally dying from the suffocation of authenticity. The shadow isn't some mystical concept that only applies to spiritual seekers or psychology students. It's the most practical, life-changing work you'll ever do because it's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that hold your power, your creativity, your ability to create boundaries, your capacity for healthy aggression, your natural magnetism, your authentic voice. From the moment you were born, you started learning which parts of yourself were acceptable and which parts would get you rejected, punished, or abandoned. Every time your parents frowned when you got angry, every time you were told to be quiet when you wanted to speak up, every time you were shamed for being too much or not enough, a part of your authentic self got pushed into the shadow. But here's what I discovered that completely changed my understanding of this process. The shadow isn't just personal, it's generational. The parts of yourself that you've been most ashamed of are often the exact same parts that your parents, your grandparents, your entire lineage had to suppress to survive. Your anger isn't just your anger. It's the accumulated rage of generations of people who had to swallow their truth to stay safe. Think about this for a moment. If your grandfather had to suppress his authentic voice to survive in an oppressive system, and your father had to suppress his emotional expression to avoid his father's rage, and you had to suppress your natural assertiveness to avoid your father's disapproval. You're not just carrying your own shadow material. You're carrying the shadow of your entire lineage. This is why shadow work is so powerful and so terrifying. When you start to integrate your shadow, you're not just healing yourself, you're breaking generational patterns that have been passed down through your family line for decades, maybe centuries. In narcissistic families, the shadow work becomes even more complex because you're not just dealing with your own rejected parts, you're dealing with the narcissist's projected shadow. Every time your narcissistic parent called you selfish, they were projecting their own selfishness onto you. Every time they accused you of being manipulative, they were seeing their own manipulation reflected back at them. You became the container for everything they couldn't face about themselves. This is why the golden child role is so insidious. You didn't just learn to suppress your authentic self, you learned to become the opposite of everything the narcissist rejected about themselves. If they were chaotic, you became overly controlled. If they were emotional, you became numb. If they were selfish, you became self-sacrificing to the point of self-destruction. But here's the breakthrough that nobody talks about. The golden child doesn't just suppress their shadow, they become addicted to being the opposite of their shadow. You become addicted to being the good one, the responsible one, the one who never causes problems. And this addiction to being perfect, to being acceptable, to being safe, this is what keeps you trapped in a life that feels like it belongs to someone else. I want to share with you a story that illustrates this perfectly. When I was 25, I was working as a lawyer, living at home, following the path that had been laid out for me. On the surface, everything looked perfect. I was successful, responsible, making good money, making my parents proud. But inside, I was dying. I would wake up every morning feeling like I was suffocating, like I was living someone else's life. One day, I was in a meeting with senior partners at the law firm, and they were discussing a case that I knew was ethically questionable. Every fiber of my being wanted to speak up, to challenge them, to say what I really thought. But instead, I sat there in silence, nodding along, being the good, agreeable junior associate. And in that moment, I felt something inside me die. I felt my authentic voice, my moral compass, my natural sense of justice. I felt it all get pushed deeper into the shadow. That night, I went home and looked at myself in the mirror, and I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. I had become so good at being what everyone else wanted me to be that I had completely lost touch with who I actually was. And that's when I realized my shadow wasn't my enemy. My shadow was the part of me that was trying to keep my authentic self alive. But here's what I discovered that night when I met my shadow. Every single trait that I had been taught to despise about myself was actually a superpower that had been inverted. My anger wasn't destructive rage. It was righteous fury at injustice. My selfishness wasn't narcissistic entitlement. It was healthy self-preservation. My rebellion wasn't disrespectful defiance. It was authentic self-expression. The shadow work process isn't about becoming a different person. It's about becoming a complete person. It's about integrating all the parts of yourself that you've been taught to reject so that you can show up in the world as your full, authentic self instead of this carefully curated version that's designed to keep everyone else comfortable. Let me walk you through the comprehensive process that transformed my life. And I'm going to give you techniques that most shadow work teachers are too afraid to share because they're too raw, too real, too potentially disruptive to the people-pleasing patterns that keep you trapped. The first step is shadow identification. And this is where most people get stuck because they're looking in the wrong places. Your shadow isn't hiding in some deep, mysterious place. It's hiding in plain sight. It's in every person who triggers you, every emotion you judge as wrong, every trait you criticize in others. Here's a technique that will blow your mind. For the next week, every time someone annoys you, irritates you, or makes you feel judgmental, write down exactly what they're doing that bothers you. Don't analyze it. Don't try to be spiritual about it. Just write it down. At the end of the week, look at that list. That's your shadow staring back at you. Every single thing that triggers you in others is a disowned part of yourself. When I did this exercise, I was horrified. I realized that every person I judged as selfish, aggressive, or attention-seeking was reflecting back parts of myself that I had buried so deep I didn't even know they existed. My wife would point out my insecurities, and instead of getting defensive, I started asking myself, where am I insecure? Where am I seeking validation? Where am I being the very thing I'm criticizing her for? But here's where it gets really interesting. I started noticing that the people who triggered me the most were actually the people who were living out aspects of my shadow that I secretly envied. The confident person who took up space in conversations, I judged them as arrogant, but secretly I wished I could be that comfortable with my own voice. The person who said no without explanation, I judged them as selfish, but secretly I wished I could prioritize my own needs like that. This is what Jung called the golden shadow, the positive qualities that you've rejected because you were taught they were wrong or dangerous. Maybe you were taught that confidence was arrogance, so you suppressed your natural charisma. Maybe you were taught that anger was bad, so you suppressed your natural ability to set boundaries. Maybe you were taught that wanting attention was narcissistic, so you suppressed your natural desire to be seen and appreciated. The second step is shadow dialogue, and this is where the real magic happens. You don't just acknowledge these rejected parts, you have conversations with them. You treat them like real aspects of yourself that have been exiled and need to be welcomed home. I started doing active imagination exercises where I would literally talk to my anger, my selfishness, my rebellion, and ask them what they needed, what they were trying to protect, what gifts they had for me. Let me share with you exactly how I did this, because most people make this process way too complicated. I would sit in a quiet room, close my eyes, and imagine myself having a conversation with the part of me that I had been rejecting. I would literally speak out loud to my anger and say, I know I've been pushing you away, but I want to understand you. What are you trying to tell me? What are you trying to protect? And then I would listen, not with my analytical mind, but with my intuitive awareness. And my anger would respond. It would tell me that it had been protecting my boundaries for years, but I had been so afraid of it that I let people walk all over me. It would tell me that it wasn't destructive rage. It was life force energy, trying to move through me, trying to help me stand up for myself, trying to help me create the space I needed to be authentic. My selfishness told me that it was actually self-love in disguise, trying to teach me that my needs mattered too. It told me that it wasn't about taking from others, it was about honoring myself enough to ask for what I needed, to create boundaries around my time and energy, to stop sacrificing myself on the altar of other people's comfort. My rebellion told me that it was my authentic voice trying to break free from the prison of people-pleasing. It told me that it wasn't about being disrespectful or difficult. It was about having the courage to disagree, to have my own opinions, to stand up for what I believed in even when it made others uncomfortable. But here's what nobody tells you about shadow dialogue. These conversations can be intense, emotional, even frightening. You're literally talking to parts of yourself that have been banished, rejected, shamed for years or decades. They are angry. They are hurt. They have things to say that you might not want to hear. I remember one conversation with my shadow where it told me, "You've been pretending to be this spiritual, evolved person, but you're just as petty and jealous and insecure as everyone else. The difference is, you're too cowardly to admit it." That was hard to hear, but it was also liberating, because it meant I could stop pretending to be perfect and start being real. The third step is shadow integration, and this is where most people chicken out because it requires you to actually embody these rejected parts in healthy ways. You can't just understand your shadow intellectually. You have to live it, express it, let it move through you in conscious, intentional ways. I started setting boundaries with my parents for the first time in my life. not from a place of anger, but from a place of integrated power. I started saying no to requests that didn't serve me, not from a place of selfishness, but from a place of self-respect. I started expressing my opinions, even when they made people uncomfortable, not from a place of rebellion, but from a place of authenticity. But let me give you some specific examples of what shadow integration actually looks like in practice, because this is where most people get confused. They think shadow integration means becoming an a-hole or letting their worst impulses run wild. That's not integration, that's shadow possession. True shadow integration means finding healthy, conscious ways to express the energy that's been trapped in your shadow. If your shadow contains anger, integration doesn't mean becoming an angry person. It means learning to use that anger energy to set boundaries, to fight for justice, to protect what matters to you. If your shadow contains selfishness, integration doesn't mean becoming a narcissist. It means learning to prioritize your own needs, to ask for what you want, to stop sacrificing yourself for others' comfort. If your shadow contains rebellion, integration doesn't mean becoming defiant for the sake of it. It means learning to question authority, to think for yourself, to stand up for your beliefs, even when it's unpopular. I started practicing what I call conscious shadow expression. When I felt anger rising in my body, instead of suppressing it or letting it explode unconsciously, I would find healthy ways to express it. I would go for a run and let the anger move through my body. I would write in my journal and let the anger speak its truth. I would have difficult conversations where I express my anger in a clear, direct way without attacking the other person. When I felt my selfishness arising, instead of judging it or pushing it away, I would ask myself, what do I need right now? What would honoring myself look like in this situation? And then I would take action to meet those needs, even if it disappointed others. When I felt my rebellion stirring, instead of suppressing it to keep the peace, I would ask myself, what am I being asked to go along with that doesn't align with my values? What would it look like to stand up for what I believe in? And then I would speak my truth, even if it made others uncomfortable. But here's what nobody tells you about shadow work. It's going to make some people very uncomfortable. The people who benefited from your shadow being suppressed are going to resist your integration process. Your family is going to call you selfish when you start honoring your needs. Your friends are going to call you aggressive when you start setting boundaries. Your partner is going to call you difficult when you stop being the accommodating people pleaser they fell in love with. This is the test. This is where you find out if you're really committed to your wholeness or if you're just playing spiritual games. Because shadow integration isn't a solo journey. It's a relational process. You have to be willing to show up differently in your relationships, even if it means some of those relationships don't survive the process. My wife struggled with my shadow integration more than anyone. She had fallen in love with the safe, predictable, controllable version of me. When I started expressing my authentic masculine energy, when I started taking up space, when I started having opinions and boundaries, she didn't know how to relate to me anymore. She would say things like, "You're becoming someone I don't recognize," or "You're turning into your father." But here's what I realized. She wasn't afraid of me becoming my father. She was afraid of me becoming myself. Because a man who has integrated his shadow is no longer controllable. He's no longer predictable. He's no longer safe in the way that serves other people's need for control. This created a crisis in our relationship that we're still navigating. She would try to shame me back into my old patterns by calling me selfish or aggressive or difficult. And there were moments when I almost gave in, when I almost went back to being the accommodating people pleaser because it was easier than dealing with her discomfort. But I realized that if I abandoned my shadow integration to make her comfortable, I would be betraying myself in the deepest possible way. I would be choosing her approval over my own wholeness. And that's not love, that's codependency. The fourth step is what I call shadow embodiment. And this is where you learn to express your integrated shadow in ways that serve your highest good and the highest good of others. Your anger becomes fierce compassion. Your selfishness becomes healthy self-care. Your rebellion becomes authentic leadership. I started my YouTube channel as an act of shadow embodiment. For years, I had been hiding my voice, my opinions, my knowledge, because I was afraid of being seen as arrogant or attention-seeking. But I realized that my desire to be seen, to be heard, to share my gifts wasn't narcissistic. It was my authentic self trying to serve others through my own transformation. The process of creating content, of putting myself out there, of sharing my story and my insights, this was my shadow integration in action. I was taking the parts of myself that I had been taught to hide and using them to help others heal and grow. But even this process triggered more shadow material. Every time I posted a video, I would feel waves of shame and fear. Who was I to teach others? What if people thought I was arrogant? What if I was just another narcissist pretending to help people while really just feeding my own ego? These fears were my shadow, trying to keep me small, trying to keep me safe, trying to protect me from the vulnerability of being seen. But I realized that these fears were also pointing me toward my next level of growth. Every time I felt afraid to share something, every time I felt like I was being too much or too bold or too visible, that was exactly what I needed to do. The fifth step is what I call shadow mastery. And this is where you learn to work with your shadow as an ally rather than an enemy. You stop trying to eliminate or suppress your shadow, and you start using its energy to fuel your growth, your creativity, your impact in the world. I learned to check in with my shadow regularly. When I was making decisions, I would ask myself, what does my shadow think about this? What is it trying to tell me? What energy is it offering me? And I would listen to its wisdom, even when it was uncomfortable or inconvenient. My shadow became my BS detector. When I was being too nice, too accommodating, too willing to sacrifice myself for others' comfort, my shadow would speak up and remind me to honor my own needs. When I was being too spiritual, too positive, too unwilling to acknowledge difficult truths, my shadow would ground me in reality. My shadow also became my creative fuel. The parts of myself that I had been most ashamed of, my anger, my intensity, my desire for recognition, these became the driving forces behind my content creation, my coaching, my mission to help others break free from narcissistic programming. But here's the most important thing I want you to understand about shadow work. It's not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming real. It's about showing up in the world as your full, authentic, integrated self instead of this carefully curated version that's designed to keep everyone else comfortable. The shadow work process isn't linear. You don't just integrate your shadow once and move on. It's an ongoing process of discovering new layers, new aspects of yourself that have been hidden, new ways of expressing your wholeness in the world. Every time you level up in your life, new shadow material emerges because you're ready to integrate more of your power. I'm still doing shadow work. I'm still discovering parts of myself that I had rejected or suppressed. I'm still learning to express my authentic self in ways that serve my highest good and the highest good of others. This isn't a destination. It's a way of living. But here's what I can tell you with absolute certainty. The day you stop running from your shadow and start integrating it is the day your real life begins. It's the day you stop living as half a person and start living as your full, authentic, powerful self. The people who have controlled you, manipulated you, made you feel small, they were terrified of your shadow because they knew that if you ever integrated it, you would become unstoppable. You would become someone who couldn't be controlled, couldn't be manipulated, couldn't be made to feel small. Your shadow isn't your enemy. Your shadow is your ally. It's the part of you that's been waiting in the darkness for you to be brave enough to reclaim it. It's the part of you that holds your power, your authenticity, your freedom. In my next video, We're going to explore something that most people aren't ready to hear. We're going to talk about spiritual warfare, about what happens when your shadow work opens doors to other realms, about the spiritual dimensions of trauma that the mainstream healing industry refuses to acknowledge. But for now, I want you to start paying attention to your triggers. I want you to start noticing what you judge in others. I want you to start asking yourself, what parts of me have I been hiding? What aspects of my authentic self have I been taught to reject? What would it look like if I stopped running from my shadow and started integrating it? Your wholeness is waiting for you. Your power is waiting for you. Your authentic self is waiting for you. And it's all hiding in the very places you've been taught to never look. The question is, are you brave enough to go there? The journey into your shadow isn't comfortable. It's not safe. It's not easy. But it's the only path to true freedom, true authenticity, true power. And on the other side of that journey is the person you were always meant to be, whole, integrated, unstoppable, and finally free.